May 1942. Somewhere on the wet training grounds of southern England, American officers arriving in Britain saw an army that did not train like a parade ground force preparing for a distant war. They saw British infantrymen crawling under wire, crossing obstacle courses, moving through smoke, and learning to advance while live fire cracked above them. This was not the image many Americans had expected from an army that had been driven from Dunkirk only 2 years earlier. Britain had lost equipment, vehicles, artillery, and confidence in 1940. But what it had not lost was the ability to study defeat, absorb its lessons, and rebuild its soldiers around the brutal reality of close combat. The American army was expanding at an industrial speed. Its strength lay in mass, logistics, standardized instruction, and the ability to turn a civilian nation into a global fighting machine. British training, by contrast, had been shaped by immediate danger. The invasion scare after Dunkirk, the fighting in North Africa, and the hard lessons of early defeats forced Britain to ask a colder question. Not how many men could be trained quickly, but how a small section of infantry could survive when artillery, tanks, aircraft, and supply lines were not enough. By 1942, this question had produced a network of battle schools across Britain, where soldiers, non-commissioned officers, and officers were pushed through realistic assault courses, fieldcraft exercises, and live-fire demonstrations. The Imperial War Museum records British battle school training in 1942, including men completing assault courses and sliding down high walls by ropes, while another record describes a 25-day course for officers, NCOs, and men at Aldeburgh in Suffolk. To the American observer, this could look almost primitive beside the scale of American preparation. There were no vast motor pools on display, no endless columns of new equipment, no promise that machines alone would solve the problem. Instead, the emphasis fell on the man, his section, his discipline, and his ability to keep moving when the battlefield became confusing. The National Army Museum preserves images of 44th Division Battle School training at Tunbridge in 1942, where infantry crawled beneath rough obstacles as part of the hardening process before overseas service. That was the first shock. British training did not try to hide fear from the soldier. It tried to introduce him to fear early, under control, before the enemy did it for real. The surprise deepened when American officers looked more closely at what British instructors were trying to create. The aim was not simply fitness, and it was not simply obedience. It was controlled initiative. British training after the disasters of 1940 had been forced to move away from the assumption that neat formations and rigid instructions would survive first contact with a modern battlefield. The German army had shown, in France and the Low Countries, how quickly a well-equipped force could be paralyzed if junior leaders waited too long for orders. Britain's answer was not to copy Germany exactly, but to harden its own infantry culture around section leadership, fieldcraft, camouflage, movement, and aggression at the lowest level. The National Army Museum describes the British Parachute Regiment, created in 1942, as a force trained to be resilient, disciplined, versatile, aggressive in battle, and self-reliant, and those qualities reflected a wider wartime lesson spreading through British specialist training. This was where American officers began to notice the difference. In the American system, the power of the Army often came from coordination. Artillery batteries, armor, engineers, trucks, air support, and the enormous machinery of supply. That system would later prove devastating across France and Germany. But British battle training often began from the opposite assumption. What if the radio failed? What if the platoon commander was hit? What if the road was mined, the armor delayed, and the section suddenly had to cross open ground under fire? The British soldier was trained to keep thinking in those moments, not because he was independent of the army, but because the army knew the battlefield would constantly break the plan. This philosophy was even more obvious in commando training. The commandos, raised after Dunkirk for raids against occupied Europe, were trained at special centers in Scotland in physical fitness, survival, orienteering, close-quarter combat, silent killing, signaling, amphibious and cliff assault, weapons handling, and demolitions. Men who failed to meet the standard were returned to their units. To visiting Americans, this was a different kind of military education. It was not built around polishing every soldier into the same shape. It was built around finding men who could act under pressure, improvise with limited tools, and still remain disciplined. The shock was not that British soldiers trained hard. American soldiers trained hard too. The shock was that British training made hardship feel like doctrine. It turned discomfort, confusion, rain, mud, fatigue, and fear into familiar conditions, so that when battle came, the soldier was not entering a new world. He was returning to one he had already rehearsed. By 1943, this method had become more than a British internal reform. It had become something the Americans were sent to experience for themselves. The Imperial War Museum preserves records of American Army officers undergoing British battle school training during the Second World War, a revealing detail because it shows that this was not just informal admiration from a distance. It was structured exposure. American officers were being placed inside the British system to see how battle inoculation, assault drills, and infantry realism were being taught before men crossed the Channel or entered other theaters of war. What they encountered was a training culture that deliberately compressed the battlefield into a controlled course. Men advanced through smoke, noise, obstacles, mud, and simulated fire, not because instructors believed training could perfectly reproduce combat, but because it could reduce the shock of the first encounter. At the 51st Highland Division's Battle School at Sherburne Park in Gloucestershire, Imperial War Museum material records a mortar section wading through a stream under simulated artillery fire in May 1942. At Lymington, troops of the 47th Division trained between houses and railway lines, a reminder that British instructors were preparing soldiers not only for open fields, but also for broken villages, walls, lanes, and sudden close-range engagements. For American officers, this was important because it revealed a different answer to the same problem. The United States was building the largest and most powerful Allied army of the Western War. Its genius lay in production, mobility, engineering, communications, and combined arms coordination. Britain, already wounded by years of fighting, could not afford to think only in terms of mass. It had to squeeze more judgment, endurance, and field sense from every small unit. British battle schools therefore placed unusual importance on the habits of survival. How to read ground, how to use cover, how to move without bunching, how to cross obstacles without losing momentum, and how to continue after the first plan failed. The result was not glamorous. Photographs from 44th Division Battle School near Tunbridge show men crawling under rough obstacles, exhausted on assault courses, and emerging from mud baths during training in 1942. But that was precisely the point. British instructors were not trying to make war look clean. They were trying to make training ugly enough that battle would feel less unfamiliar. And this was where the American surprise became professional respect, because the British soldier was being trained not merely to obey orders, but to remain useful when the battlefield stopped obeying anyone. The same principle appeared most clearly in the training of men prepared for raids, landings, and operations where confusion was guaranteed from the first minute. At Achnacarry in the Scottish Highlands, commando trainees were exposed to one of the most demanding schools in the British wartime system. Imperial War Museum oral histories repeatedly described the assault course there as a defining experience of commando preparation, and the National Army Museum notes that commando training included amphibious assault, cliff assault, orienteering, survival, signaling, weapons handling, demolitions, and close-quarter combat. To American officers, this was not merely specialist bravado. It was an education in operating without comfort. The commandos had been created after Dunkirk, when Britain needed a way to strike German-held Europe before it had the strength for a full return to the continent. Their raids were often small, temporary, and dangerous by design. That forced their training to value initiative over routine. A man had to climb, swim, navigate, carry explosives, recognize enemy weapons, and withdraw under pressure. He was not being prepared for one clean battlefield role. He was being prepared for the moment when a plan broke into fragments and the nearest junior leader had to decide what came next. This was the deeper reason British training impressed foreign observers. It connected physical toughness to practical battlefield use. A wet rope climb, a forced march, a river crossing, or a demolitions lesson was never presented as suffering for its own sake. It was a rehearsal for the real conditions of war. Bad weather, poor visibility, uncertain maps, damaged communications, and sudden enemy fire. Britain's combined operations experience reinforced the same logic. Imperial War Museum records from wartime signalmen and landing forces show how British personnel trained and served across multiple amphibious operations, from Sicily and Salerno to Normandy and Walcheren, where coordination between soldiers, sailors, signals, landing craft, and assault units had to work under extreme pressure. The American Army understood coordination on a scale Britain could not match. But British training showed something different: how to preserve human decision-making inside chaos. It was not larger than the American way of war. It was narrower, harsher, and intensely practical. And as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Europe, that narrow British skill began to matter far beyond the training grounds. That lesson reached its most important test in the long preparation for the return to France. By 1944, the training grounds of Britain had become a vast rehearsal area for invasion. Beaches, rivers, villages, heathland, and mock obstacles were turned into fragments of the coming battlefield. British and Allied troops did not simply learn the idea of landing in Europe. They practiced the mechanics of it again and again, because the first hours of an amphibious assault would punish hesitation. Men had to leave landing craft under fire, move across open sand, avoid mines, clear wire, push inland, and keep going even when units landed in the wrong place. The Imperial War Museum's D-Day history notes that once the landings began, chaos quickly followed, with many assault units landing far from their designated points while heavily laden men tried to move under enemy fire. This was exactly the type of battlefield British training had been preparing men to endure. Not a clean battlefield, but a confused one. The British Army's experience before 1944 had taught that courage alone was not enough. Courage had to be organized into habits. A man had to know how to keep his weapon dry, how to move behind a tank without being crushed or exposed, how to follow a sergeant when officers were missing, and how to turn an unexpected wall, ditch, or ruined house into cover rather than an obstacle. The training was physical, but its final purpose was mental steadiness. American officers could recognize the value of that. Their own army had trained on a huge scale in Britain for the same invasion, and American troops also used British terrain to practice landing craft drills and assault procedures. At Braunton Burrows in Devon, concrete mock-ups of landing craft were built so troops could practice embarkation and debarkation on dry land before the real crossing. But British training culture carried the additional weight of an island that had lived under threat since 1940. It had the feel of a country that had already imagined invasion from the receiving end and now trained to reverse it. The practical value of this became visible in Normandy, not because every British unit performed perfectly, but because no Allied army performed perfectly on D-Day. The real measure was recovery. When plans broke, when radios failed, when beach exits jammed, and when German resistance appeared in unexpected places, training had to take over. That was where the British emphasis on fieldcraft, junior leadership, and rehearsed hardship found its meaning. It gave small groups the confidence to keep moving through disorder, and in a landing operation, movement itself could be survival. By the end of the war, the real answer to why American officers were shocked by British training was not that Britain had discovered a secret method unknown to everyone else. It was that Britain had been forced by defeat, shortage, geography, and experience to train men for the moment when systems failed. American power in the Second World War became overwhelming because it could move armies, feed them, arm them, replace losses, and sustain operations on a scale Germany could not match. British training impressed because it attacked the smaller but equally dangerous problem inside that vast war. What happens to the individual soldier when the smoke closes in, the officer is gone, the map is wrong, and the next decision cannot wait? The British system never replaced mass, firepower, armor, or air support. It depended on them just as every modern army did. But it treated the trained man as the final weapon that had to keep functioning after the machinery of battle became confused. That was visible in the battle schools, in commando training, in amphibious preparation, and in the rehearsals that preceded the Normandy landings. The Imperial War Museum describes Operation Overlord as the largest combined naval, military, and air operation ever seen, yet its success still depended on men stepping from landing craft, crossing exposed beaches, and pushing inland under conditions no plan could fully control. That was the contrast American officers noticed. The United States showed how industrial power could win a world war. Britain showed how hard training could preserve judgment inside the violence of that war. One system produced immense scale, the other refined endurance, fieldcraft, and junior initiative under pressure. Together, they became stronger than either could have been alone. And perhaps that is why the lesson still matters. Training is not only about preparing soldiers to follow a plan. It is about preparing them to survive the moment the plan collapses and still move forward. If you found this documentary insightful, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more deep dives into the forgotten lessons of World War II.